Paul is going to give a presentation on MSc Students' Digital Capabilities Research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Myself and my colleagues would like to talk to you a little bit today about some student research projects around digital capabilities which have been undertaken in the School of Management. I should say right from the off that I can take no credit for the work here today because I had very little involvement really with the project. It was originally another learning technologist at our institution, Keith Brown, whose kind of brainchild this was. And Keith was working with my colleague Tony here on my left, Tony Roth, who is the academic who has kind of led things on the academic side. And I'm also joined today by George Kendrick, who is one of the students who has been actually doing the work. So the people who are really going to talk to you today are Tony, who's going to give you a kind of overview of the projects. George is here to answer any questions. And we thought in the kind of second half of the session what we might do is try and have a bit of interactivity and get you guys involved either in maybe a couple of groups depending on how many people eventually arrive to kind of generate some ideas for how we might take forward the findings of our student research projects. So I'll hand you on to Tony now.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I have to give a caveat too. I have actually no experience with a lot of this, and I really came into the table this project a little bit late, so I haven't done any work either. So basically, I'm trying to tap dance a little bit for you because if I say anything weird or different, I have a caveat and I have an out. That's my escape. But really, George is one of the students that actually worked on the project. And started developing particular ideas, and we wanted to present some of these ideas this afternoon. I'll just give you a quick background because I'm an academic, so I'm coming from it from a little bit a different point of view, and that is not knowing what digital technology is and digital capabilities really are in the classroom and how you can project those onto what is needed out in the company. Keith and I were talking about this very same thing, getting academics involved and having academics understand what they can do within the classroom in order to develop these particular type of skills. And as you know, a lot of the academics have this pressure on developing skills for students, these hard and soft type of skills. So Keith and I were talking about this, and part of it came from my interaction with a company that we were working with for a project with students. And the company was very much invested in trying to figure out how to manage knowledge within the company. It's a consulting firm. They were hiring new people, and what I mean new is people right out of the college ranks or young individuals that had a lot of interaction with social media. At the same time, they had a senior rank that didn't know how to communicate with younger people coming up, and they had to impart a lot of this knowledge because that was their job as a consulting firm. So we were talking about this. We talked about the architecture that the firm had in place in order to pass knowledge, disseminate knowledge among its people, not only within the company itself, but also its subsidiaries and their clients. And they had a tough time trying to do that. But one of the issues that came out was, well, what is it that students are learning? What is it they're bringing in? How do we communicate with them? How do we use some of this digital technology, these capabilities, et cetera, in order to disseminate that knowledge within the firm and on beyond. The hardest thing they were doing was just communicating with their own employees. So that's kind of the background that Keith and I were talking about, and that's what generated a lot of the projects we'll talk about today. We'll give you a background. We'll talk a little bit about the studies. What we did was we said, okay, let's just look and see what students are actually doing within the curriculum, and how they're doing within their studies, and how they're using this technology, and what they themselves think of this technology. And we can just contrast that against what companies are asking for and what companies are actually using in terms of their structure. So these were the studies are generated from. We gave a mandate or an objective to students and just let them go and gave them as much flexibility as possible. The only thing we told them really was that there's a difference between what companies perceive as digital technology they needed and what students are actually delivering when they come into the company ranks as young career aspirants. So that was it. And we let the students go out and formulate the different ideas in terms of what they saw and what they perceived. What we did was there's 15, I think, about 15 groups. This is a master's class. It was a year-long approach to looking at technology and research methods. We gave them this project. What I did was just grab 4 of these projects, and Keith and I looked at those, and they're kind of representative of what the class has done. So we'll look at each one of those studies, and I'll give you just a general overview of what the studies are and some of the interesting findings from them. And again, the person who's doing all the work can kind of keep me honest on what is going on and give you a little bit of insight into what his colleagues were also looking at. At the end, as Paul said, we would like to talk a little bit about your thoughts and what you see. And I think a lot of it could be generated or continued on from what we saw this morning about just different types of ways to engage the students, get them to talk about digital technology and using digital technology in the classroom. And I'll be selfish because I'll take it from me as coming from the other side and trying to engage students and using this digital technology. Okay. Background we talked about, we gave them from the Science Technology Committee, basically talked about the differences between academics, students, and what they're actually bringing and what companies want. A lot of companies want digital technology, digital capabilities from their students that are coming in and expect that given today's landscape and technology. We had a study on that, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later, about some of the findings associated with what students perceive and what is actual. Okay. I gave a background to the class. This was an international management class, so a lot of the studies you'll see have a lot of cultural themes running through them. And this was on purpose because of different type of learning capabilities, different learning styles from the students that we have coming in from different areas. So that was something important to look at. What we started out with was a quantitative study. So this study was basically designed to look at the groundwork. What is going on? What are students looking at? What is the reality? What are the receptions? Those types of issues. And they would follow on with a qualitative study that would build upon the interesting findings later on. And that's what the study is all about. So we're in the second phase, starting off with a qualitative study and building upon some of the interesting findings and digging a little bit deeper into these issues. Grouped the studies into kind of 3 groups, perception and reality. A lot of students looked at that, and perception and reality of what is going on with digital capabilities and what they're receiving, what they think they're getting, what they think they're actually delivering in terms of their digital capabilities, and what they actually see. Okay? These were tested. Critical thinking, which was interesting. We always talk about critical thinking as academics. We always tell the students you have to develop these critical thinking skills, you have to be analytical, etc. But a lot of that is really vague out there. But anyway, one student group captured this, and their premise is basically critical thinking leads to the digital capabilities. So we can argue this is a chicken and egg type of thing, but what they were saying was we have to develop the ability to critically think in order to use these digital capabilities and enhance their use and think about how to use them within the environment. And digital identity. It was something very interesting, but students were also looking at these digital IDs and how you actually brand yourself digitally. And we all have the horror stories about Facebook and what you put on Facebook and companies going back to Facebook and looking at those to kind of filter their future employees out. But that indeed is the case in many instances. And I can vouch for one conservative company in the States which actually used Facebook accounts to shortlist their candidates. And they actually grabbed people on spring break, which is one way of capturing students and seeing what they're really up to. And they actually came up and said they use that as a filtering tool. So anyway, the students have to brand themselves. They have to understand what it is that they're putting out on the internet, and they have to understand that that's forever. And everybody can capture that and see what's going on with their... Okay, this first study looked at perception versus reality. So these first two studies are perception versus reality. This study looked at the actual skills that we teach all the time, a basic skill in classes, and that's just using Microsoft Excel. So the students were looking at how they could use Microsoft Excel, using Microsoft Excel in the classroom and beyond. How do they perceive their use? If they are very confident in using Microsoft Excel, if they like using it, they can use it and put it in different types of areas. And the students went back and said, okay, if that is the case, then we'll give you a test. So they also tested their sample to see how they used it and if they were able to use it. So research questions. How do you actually assess your own capabilities? What is your, between your perception and reality? What it is in this case, they're looking at correlations, more of a methodological type of thing, but they're looking at correlations, or they're looking at whether or not this is a predictor type of relationship. Okay. And how does gender and nationality affect this? And that goes back to the idea that we're in a international school, and we also international class, so they were testing for not only gender but nationality, and looking at mostly Asian students versus European students, basically Eastern versus Western culture, to see if there's any learning differences between the two and how that affects your ability to instill those digital capabilities. Hypothesis, as you can see, people generally overestimate their Microsoft Excel skills. We're also dealing with master students, so that would be a valid hypothesis. Okay. Women and men, the differences in gender. Men overestimate, women underestimate. And that is based on previous studies, but they also wanted to test that within the academic environment. And Westerners are overconfident as opposed to Eastern cultures are underconfident in their skills, abilities. Okay. I won't show you that yet. So, going back to the first hypothesis, people overestimate their skills. They were testing master students across the campus as their sample base. So, what do you think? Would people overestimate their skills? Definitely. Okay? And they found that to be significant. And okay, people do the blue is, the green is over their estimation, and the blue is reality. So yes, everybody said I'm a master of Microsoft, but in reality, when they actually took the test, they couldn't use Microsoft as they should be able to. Okay. Gender. This shows the difference between a male and female. Okay, how would you expect to rate your Microsoft skill level? Males overestimated, and you can see what their actual score is. Women did the same thing, and you can see their actual scores. Okay, so basically everybody's overestimating their ability to use Microsoft Excel. And here we come to nationality. The blue is a test score again, and the green is how you would rate it. You rate yourself. So in this case, we're looking at Asia or Eastern versus Western cultures. Everybody's still kind of overestimating what is going on and how they are able to use Microsoft Excel in their true reality. Okay. Does that make sense, everybody? Yeah. Yes, sir. The N is small. You're right. It's I think 60 to 70.
Yeah,
you can
60 to 70 for each study was sort of our aim.
Yeah.
Simply because logistical, the time frame that we had to get
Yeah.
a larger sample size, we would have needed longer.
Yeah. So.
Oh no, we all had to actually have the verifiable data itself, and that was done in a separate assessment just to ensure that there wasn't someone just sat at a computer filling in online questionnaires for 60 different people. That was verified.
Yeah, part of it, and that's on me as an instructor, but part of it was just to get them to get going on understanding the quantitative type, and to also use some of this as preliminary to look at it further. So in a sense, back to your question, we will take this further and we will start looking at the larger community. Okay. So that was the first study, looking at just the differences between the two, perception and reality. We also have the same type of study in the second one, and I don't know if you want to speak to that, because this is actually George's study, so I'll...
So this was my own sort of personal project, of which I was sort of the lead on. As Tony mentioned earlier with the Science and Technology Committee, they, at the House of Commons, released a paper last year saying there was this digital skills crisis, and it was essentially concluding that it was up to the universities to fill the void, and that their graduates going into new jobs were not day one ready. So how can universities actually bridge that gap? But the report itself actually failed to identify a actual skill that there was a loss in. So whether it was, oh, people can't use Word, or people can't use Skype, or people can't code, there wasn't actually any tangible thing that was in the report. So that was why Tony was very much like, go free reign to whatever you wanted. So we ended up landing on video communication programs, things like Skype for Business, mainly because I just had a summer job where Skype for Business was my absolute lifeline. Without it, just none of my work could have been able to be done, or a similar video mediated program, as we termed them. So we went round essentially trying to work out whether students, one, knew how important these sort of programs were and how important those skills to use them are, and then compare it to the companies themselves that are employing, and whether there is a disparity between the two. So we obviously, I come from a scientific background, so it was interesting trying to sort of bridge my scientific thinking into a management-related thing. So having my classic null hypotheses, in that saying that the significant difference between the students and the companies on the frequency, the productivity, and actually the perceived importance of the VCP, this video communication programs, which we termed it. And we found that actually they are, that's one. Yeah. So we found that indeed there is this significant difference between the students' perceived use and productivity, and the companies portray it as absolutely essential. And we even spoke with employees of fairly large graduate intake, saying that they won't even interview those that don't have the necessary digital capabilities. And how you actually quantify that was something that we identified that we want to do in a further study, but it's quite difficult to actually tangibly quantify how good someone is at using Skype for Business. Whereas in the previous study about Excel, I think it should be important to note that their actual survey, the first part was that, okay, how do you perceive, how good do you think you are with Excel? And then the next part was, please answer this exam on how you would do these various functions in Excel. And that's how they generated their data, whereas with the Skype for Business, it was all about the perception and how often do you use it, how many hours, etc. So that's how we came up with our data. Yeah, so does that all make sense, or have I just rambled for no apparent reason? No? Good that was work. Any questions on that? No? So back in, it's all going back to, so the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Commons, 2016, they released a paper report on the digital skills crisis. A fairly significant report, but it did lack an actual, a tangible, what's the term to use? It didn't highlight any specific skills themselves. It was just saying digital literacy is in freefall, there's a deficit, and the needs aren't being met. So that was why we, as a group, we had very much a free rein as to how we could interpret this, and we were asked to essentially tackle this issue. But in order to do so, we had to identify. So that was what the various groups did.
We were doing this last summer when Keith and I were thinking about this particular project, and doing so, I looked at some of my colleagues in some schools in the U.S. where I was from, and some schools were building in digital technologies as a class in the very beginning, in their freshman year. So they would have these things like Microsoft or the hardcore, I'd say hardcore, tangible issues associated with digital tech capabilities, but they continue that throughout their curriculum. So in my area, supply chain management, they had a core in the freshman year where they had 2 or 3 classes where they were looking at digital technology. They continued that emphasis in their second year, and they actually increased a little bit more work in that, and it just piled on. They required a lot of these within the curriculum through our teaching skills. So when they graduated, they would come out with some type of skills and be able to talk to companies. Now, the caveat is, it's not so much that the academics came up with this on their own. In the Virginia area, they were demanded by companies. Companies needed to have these particular type of skills, and they needed to have the students hitting the ground running with these skills. So they didn't want to invest that time in teaching them how to do the core things. They also didn't want to invest a whole lot of time in figuring out how to manage these skills across. So you should be able to do these things like video back and forth. You should be able to understand how to combine some of these particular issues so they can step up to the next level, which is analyze and start being creative about the use of their digital technologies. And that was something they put into their curriculum. They felt strong enough to do it, and it's working. And students want this because they see this particular issue as important to them. So that's just a selfish look at it from my point, and it's just another way of generating a motivation to go forth with the study. Our third study, speaking about critical skills, again, everybody harps on this idea of developing critical skills. It's vague. It's difficult to teach students how to do critical skills. But anyway, this particular group looked at the critical skills, and they were assessing that against digital capabilities. And what they wanted to find out was whether or not critical skills were necessary in order to develop those digital capabilities. So their digital capabilities were not so much this is a Microsoft, but what can you do with Microsoft, and how can you handle data, and how can you use these particular type of issues in terms of your digital space. So that's their background and where they were coming from, and looking at critical skills as a foundation of digital capabilities. You can argue chicken and egg, and I would argue chicken and egg with them only just to force them to think about it. Mm-hmm. That's my job. But I think that's an argument and debate to be had as well. If you need those hardcore digital capabilities in order to be able to think critically, if you can combine those in order to be able to assess what's going on with new data and those types of issues. But anyway, that's a debate that we can always have. Your research question is they were looking at, again, East versus West in critical thinking. So they're trying to see if there's a difference in how you think critically or how you assess data, and whether that drove any differences in your capabilities, or whether that actually drove your ability to develop these capabilities that are needed. Oops, sorry. Okay. So to keep it within the realm of their study, they were just looking at differences between the two groups, East and West. Okay. And they found that, yes, there is a difference between how East and West thinks and how they process, and how they're actually, how this would actually go into the digital capabilities.
I think it's just
Yeah,
to
go
weigh
ahead.
in a little bit, was that this particular study I know was born out of, by this point in the semester, we'd already had several sort of group assignments, and it had become apparent that being such a culturally diverse master's course, we had seen a disparity in the marks between the different cultures. So this group, which was in fact half European, half Chinese, just as the way it worked out, decided to actually take a more of a quantitative approach to see how they could quantify and essentially create a valuable study out of it, rather than just saying, oh, that's a cool observation. So that was just as a sort of a background as to what bore that study on.
Yeah. Again, I like this particular study too, because it's on a selfish point of view, is how you actually engage with the students that are different in your classroom, different learning styles and skills, and how you can actually use digital capabilities or digital means in order to engage them. And it is difficult, as you know, trying to teach different ways to a group of students. And digital may be a way of doing that, and we saw peer-to-peer and those types of issues earlier. So this is just another way of looking at it, and this is another selfish way of pulling this particular study out and following up on this later on. Okay.
Yeah, that's
okay.
fine, yeah.
The last study is very interesting. This goes back to our idea of digital identity, and for lack of a better word, it's just branding on the internet, and how you actually brand yourself on the internet, and how you continue keep this up and continue branding yourself. But this was based on a particular study that the students used, and one of the issues they were looking at is a higher use of media. Gives you a little bit more knowledge, and you're much more familiar with your privacy settings, which is how we actually look at the characteristics of our brand, of ourselves as brand, and then how that actually comes out. So what is going on with that? The idea is the more you use your social media, the better you become, the more aware you are of what's going on out in this digital space called you, and how you interact with the world. In this study, they said, yes, that is true. The more you use it, the more you're much more aware of your identity in space. So they wanted to test that particular idea and to see if it held true for the students at Bath. Okay. So they used their particular model. You can see the hypothesis. The higher the frequency of social media use, Facebook and all those issues, the stronger your privacy setting. The privacy setting is basically looking at your attributes of yourself, and then you're much more aware of your digital identity, of what you're actually putting out there. And this is the model they used, which is basically built on the Boyd and Harjiti. Well, okay, that study, the 2010 study. So they went back and retested this particular study. Results. That was a kind of wake up. This is really nothing. I don't want you guys to mess with this. I threw that in there. There's a lot of things that are going on into your digital branding. So there's a lot of issues that they have to be aware of. Okay. So what are the results of that? They found it just the opposite. The more students used the social media, the more complacent they became, and the much more confident they became in their use. And so they didn't pay attention to their privacy settings. They didn't update it as often as they should. They weren't that much aware of their digital branding. So that was here on the master students of Bath, which is interesting to see. Whoops. So those are kind of the idea of the 4 studies. We have findings of the 4 studies, or recommendations of the 4 studies. There's the perception versus reality, the digital ID, as well as, I forgot the third one.
Video communication.
Yeah, the communication and
Excel, ID, and critical thinking.
critical thinking, yes, thank you. Okay. So the students were also had to come up with particular recommendations. And again, this is a mandate that we asked for them to do, is to think about what this actually means, what their study is actually giving them, and how they can actually put things into the classroom and recommend for us to use. And it's much more the student engagement aspect of the study. Well, study one, when we talked about perception, we could say that students want much more of the interaction. They want much more of these projects to teach Microsoft, those type of things, but not so much from an academic point of view. What they want is the projects in the real world type of settings. So from an academic standpoint, we should go out and talk to companies and bring in data and those type of issues and give them a particular project to use this Microsoft Excel and why you would use the Microsoft Excel in a company setting. So benign databases going back and forth would not work for them. Okay. Another thing I thought was interesting too is how you actually learn, and YouTube video came up a lot. Just looking at the YouTubes and those types of visual learning would help as they go through their training. Okay. Again, this is perception versus reality, the frequency used. I just threw those in there a little bit to remind everybody about where they stood. Okay. Second study. This is you guys. Sorry.
Well, as for us, trying to get people to have a better sort of business use, I'm using quotation marks, business use of Skype or video communication programs is a little bit difficult when you're still at a university level. Skype, for most people, particularly in our year group, was simply for communicating with friends and family in other countries. If they had little or no work experience in a company which doesn't use these programs, they wouldn't see the actual importance. And so trying to emphasize upon them how important it was without real-world work with these programs would be fairly impossible. So there were a few pilot studies done in universities on the East Coast in Boston, as well as in Hong Kong, that were using essentially remote modules. So this would be an elective module that some students could do, where essentially they only interact with their group mates through these programs. And so it really integrates the assignment within the program itself. The only issue there is that you will get sort of pigeonholed within one program, and if that one program then later on in life becomes useless or outsourced or otherwise changed, then you're kind of set in your ways and you can't adapt. So this was a little bit more tricky to write about the recommendations that the university could implement to upskill the students in the use of this program.
Yeah, just go back on that. That was a very good recommendation as well. A couple years ago, we had an instructor who was looking at virtual teaming, and she came from an organizational standpoint, but her classroom was built on having teams from different countries. So we were stationed in Bath. She had a colleague in the States and another colleague, I think, in Europe somewhere. But anyway, they had a project to do, and they were required to interact with each other, given all the time constraints, the time zones and everything else, but they had to work with each other in order to develop this particular project. And that was very good. Unfortunately, she left right when it got started. So hopefully, I think the school is developing something along those lines as well in order to to address what George is talking about. Okay. The third, mobile apps. Keith is very much invested, and he is very much of an advocate for using mobile apps in the classroom. The students, as you know, don't pay much attention, at least in my experience, to the Moodle or the boards or the standard type of platforms that we use in order to communicate with students, and they're much more apt to look at the apps, and they can do that on the fly. But the mobile apps will give you much more of engagement, period. And I think some of those things came out this morning. So that's one of the things the students are talking about. They want to use these particular type of issues. I will say last fall I used it for a huge class, and it's about engaging the students, getting them to think about using the mobile app, and it didn't occur really until towards the end of the class when exams were coming up, and all of a sudden the mobile app became much more active as students were engaging with wanting to know what's on exam and those type of things and cleaning up for their revision. However, it's a very good tool to use because there were some activity throughout the semester of students catching up, trying to figure out what's going on, missing particular lectures and those types of things. So I would say in this case, one of the things that is not there is the engagement from the academic standpoint and getting the academic to actually become much more involved in using that mobile app. And I think it's incumbent upon us really to try to teach that and get that going, and students will follow suit. The digital IDs, that is a continual type of thing. It's a personal issue, but it's also very important, as we know, because of the digital IDs and the problems of cybersecurity and those types of things that are going on. But the point to get across is students cannot be complacent with understanding what the social ID is, with understanding what social media is and how it's actually used. I think students have that immortality type of thing. But the idea is understanding how to use LinkedIn, marrying that up with your Facebook, understanding how you develop your particular networks, and controlling that particular ID. One of the things that came out too is we were talking to this company that I alluded to earlier, which is a consulting firm that deals with technology and knowledge assessment, is using this because they don't want a lot of their issues to come out. So some of those are, protected issues. So students have to understand how to protect that particular aspect of it. Okay. So, okay. Again, the common theme throughout is workshops. Students want real life, real world type of scenarios when they're using this particular issues or capabilities and development of those capabilities. So that comes back to, again, to the instructors and finding those real world aspects. So, okay. I will stop here, I think. We wanted to talk a little bit about developing these. I don't want to.
Do you want me to jump?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. So I think for me, kind of coming into this project towards the end of things, having Keith being the main person who was involved in supporting Tony, I'm really interested in, given the data that we've got here from real-life students, how we address things and take things forward in terms of delivering the opportunities for digital capabilities, upskilling for students. We heard earlier today, sure some of you were in the presentation about the DigiBuds project, which I thought sounded fantastic. My own feeling is that given kind of HE funding, there are not necessarily large amounts of cash around for learning technologists like myself, and I'm sure many other of you in the room, to drive these kinds of things. So perhaps it's the case that what we need is a range of different approaches to providing these opportunities for students, whether they be through curriculum-based projects like Tony's, or whether they be in partnership with the Students' Union, different things here and there which can work together to build up an overall framework, if you like, of opportunity for students to engage with these issues, because I think one thing that comes through from what you guys have been saying is that students recognize that actually this is important and they need to engage with it. So I thought that in this post-lunchtime slot, what we might do now is just divide you guys up into some groups and ask you, what are you doing in your own institutions? What's working for you in engaging students? What's not working? What are the barriers? And this kind of thing. So I think if we maybe go for 3 groups, and I'm going to ask Gordon because he's so helpful to just move across here for me. And if we make you 4 guys one group, and if we make you 4 another group, and we'll have another group here. I don't know if you want to hop in as well. Feel free. So, see what I put on the slide. So I just put up a few starter questions, really. What are some practical responses that we might take to giving students more opportunities to develop digital capabilities? What's working at your institution? What isn't? What are barriers to progress? But don't feel constrained by my questions. Feel free to throw anything in that you think is relevant. So if we give you, how much time have we got left?
15 minutes left and then 5 minutes.
15 minutes, perfect. Okay, so if we give you about 8-10 minutes or so to have a talk about that in your groups, and then, or maybe a little bit less than 10 minutes, because it would be good to have your feedback to the group. Is that okay? And we'll wander around and earwig on your conversations.
I wanted to get a picture of you hanging out. That should be good.
So if we do three groups, we can
Yeah.
jump on one each.
Yeah. I'll take my notes. Sorry, take my notes.
Touch here.
I'll hang out over here.
I think it's just if we progress more with the steps like in the student accounts or in the workshop in here after this session, we've got proper information about overall transformation from knowledge to we're not progress the student side as well. But we'll be walking off once the student and kind of more technical discussion that can make it like take examples of where we go in about making people
Right.
and actually involving the academics. I think one of the seconds this morning was involving the academics was Nationality and ideas or careers and another I think is hopefully where we might go some also I can identify more different cultures so identifying the stuff what are core tools or core levels of aspects from that
Yeah.
And that's a great study, but it's only a little bit of the...
Absolutely.
It's just the start of the...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we run a quite a much look at what we do I think they're not aware of it and their perception of their messaging.
Yeah.
Before with an 4 o'clock and we hadn't realised you could always table content at work. You know, so you type in the numbers.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
I had a student in tears last year, education student who would spend a whole day trying to sort out her table of contents manually because I've not completely panicked. So I kind of practiced sorting out in about 20 minutes ago. She was practically in tears again because she was sort of can't believe how easy it was. I mean, if you then had to get the
Media or
Yeah.
trial, you know, is it a good thing, is it a bad thing?
And it's not the issue that we again, the assumption is that students will know it. That's an issue students are international students who want to but again, practicality is the thing that expect you to learn to know it. You can probably do this stuff. The assumption is they know it. They don't have experience.
Yeah.
There isn't a doubt that they're in their
Yeah.
hands that they don't
Yeah.
and we did try to say, okay, when assessing students we could, they could. But then there's a lot of problems with that because then they might not come because they're put up all this stuff and then they put the project so they don't want to put you tell us. You tell them we should do it because they've got things in place to help them do it. And they're not going to tell them they need to do all those things before they start. So they're not, you know, why not tell them to say the problem that you need to know? Let them, you know, have a way of sessions and then we'll pull it down. That's another issue, you know, and not putting them off by saying, you know, all this stuff and then let's go.
I think there's also that thing, sometimes it's like in the wrong direction, which works for a while until you exhaust that direction, and then actually you've got to go right back to start J, because if they set off right, the whole thing would have been much easier. So I think come up with any practical responses.
Are any of you using, I wonder, some kind of questionnaire for students on entry for them to self-assess on digital skills?
Just a little
Yeah.
and take that further, really. Aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's, personally, I think that's a
Quite hard,
really...
actually, to devise a decent
It is. Yeah, I agree. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Particularly at Bath, I know one of the civil engineering courses, some of the early first-year modules incorporate coding and programming, but to do with sort of their actual civil engineering assignments. So having to essentially create a code or a program which does the work that Excel would do if you knew how to use it. But obviously, coding and programming is so important nowadays. So it's just one way of incorporating, as you were going on about saying, how you actually incorporate these skills within the degree, because you have to make it relevant to the degree. Because as Fiona was saying this morning, you know, if you start talking about research methods or statistics, they want it relevant and to their degree. That's why they came to university. Certainly when, I mean, as a scientist, when I came into this management master's course, they started talking about sort of research methods. I'm like, okay, I can see how that is all applicable to when I do an experiment in the lab, but I can't see how I can do it in a management perspective, and that was lacking certainly in the module itself. So it was only then when you got my teeth sunk into these projects here, you think, okay, actually here's how it's applicable, but it's only in the later stages of the module that becomes apparent.
Knowing it,
exactly, which I thought was a bit weird. Okay. Oh, it's incredible number of resources available.
Can I say something quick? Because that's a neat point that you made. One of the things that came up too is the students understand all this. I mean, that's foreign to this social ID and everything else. But one of the things that came up is they see that as a part. All these programs that student services
she was very much
are apart from.
How can I get
bolt-on? So,
and employment has.
From my standpoint, how do you do that within the classroom as part of your curriculum? As part of, always embedded in there.
Most
to putting out
simple personal experience
academic
for myself and also my friends
things.
and colleagues, when they go into
I have
an
no
office-based
idea.
job, 90% of what they're working
And I hate to
with
give it a
is
bolt-on
Excel.
because
Now,
they'll
whether
see it
that's
as that.
just an anomaly in terms of the sample,
And I think that's what some of
I
the
know
results
it
came out.
is fairly essential to most working environments. So that was just one of the topics that this group went after.
Exactly.
But you're right, we say it's a digital skill maybe is a bit of a misnomer,
but I think it has to be to a certain extent if you're developing culture, because they do understand it.
So that we can actually
but if you're developing a particular culture, I don't know how you would do that.
Quantitative study out of it.
That's what it is.
But actually, you have to kind of decide for yourself to engage with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Therefore, you don't
Yeah.
just have a problem, you have a problem to look.
Okay.
No, I do, yeah.
Right. I guess we'd better head towards
Okay.
wrapping up. Thank you, everyone.
That's what I was about to say. I think it's academics
still chatting.
because yes, and I'm telling myself a little bit, but you get locked in, and it's easier too. I mean, you've done it before, and you say, "Oh, it won't work because the student won't accept this. It's too much. I have to learn how to do it myself in order to." And I raised that issue. We only have to work with Keith and Paul, but we've had away days where everybody says the same type of thing. If only it were easier, if we only understood exactly what we need to do, blah, blah, blah. So I think that's where the block is. Not me. I mean, I'm kind of perfect, but no, but but that is, I think. Sorry,
No,
Paul.
that's fine. Thank you, everyone. I think there was a lot of interesting discussion there from the sounds of things. Can I just quickly ask someone from each group just to feedback one thing, anything you like about your conversation that you've just had? Can we start with you guys?
No, because then it turns into a unified discussion.
John, please.
My point was not what degree to do them short. My thing, what I think is important, I think you said earlier on about critical thinking.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, actually, if, especially in the context of Excel or something like that, if they had the problem solving and critical thinking skills, then they find ways of learning to do what they need to do with Excel.
Right.
There are plenty of free resources out there, YouTube, chopped with full of stuff that need to do what you need to do on YouTube.
Yeah.
So if you're running a course, the conflict between trying to embed something around digital capability.
Yeah.
We're not learning Excel as a digital capability is another issue, but anyway, should I be spending my time developing their critical thinking skills and problem solving skills or digital capability given that I've got limited knowledge?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that feeds into getting students to see the importance and take the initiative because they've got to own it.
Because, and also, how you use Excel now won't be how you use it in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. This group. Who wants to volunteer? I like that. And group 3.
Well, I think we agree that actually it's very difficult to, because people's perceptions aren't accurate about their digital skills, and that we put a whole raft of offerings out there, but if they're not targeted to the right people at the right time, then actually the uptake is not nowhere near as good.
Yeah.
And actually, you forget skills if you don't use them. So
Absolutely.
It's very much targeting to the right people, I think, at the right time.
At the right time. Okay, thank you very much. I will just very quickly share something that we're hoping to do at our institution, which is really Keith's brainchild, and his idea is for getting going some kind of students' digital skills centre where basically you would have students involved in the production of digital assets and learning objects and things for academic staff who I think at lots of institutions, certainly ours, often have ideas about how they want to use bits of technology in their learning and teaching, but they don't necessarily have the skills or the knowledge of the online pedagogy or the time to actually go out and develop the resources. And although learning technologists like myself exist in the institution, there aren't many of us, and these projects actually can be very time-consuming to build. So the idea behind it is that if you get the students involved in building the resources under some guidance from learning technologists and the academics as to what's going to be in that resource, the students have an opportunity then to gain the skills, potentially to gain a bit of money from doing it as well, and that the institution then gets an output of reusable stuff which feeds into more innovative digital use of learning and teaching. We need some funding though. Tony, do you want to sum up? I know you had a
it's all academics'
slide
fault,
there.
or I don't know. No, No, thank you very much for that. Listening to my tap dance a little bit, but it's exciting to me because it's just another side that I don't really see that much, and that's how you get students engaged with technology, and it's within the classroom, excuse me, and it's frustrating to a certain extent. A student's actually telling you kind of what they want. It's just actually listening to it and actually going over that hump of learning what it is that's out there and using these tools. And again, I'll tell myself, but I really wasn't that aware of all these particular issues out there until I start talking to Keith and getting Paul involved into this. But it's just communication and changing the culture. Students know it. Academics know it. It's just that bridge, I think, is the biggest thing. Good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's my self-confession for the day, and I'm done. So classes are over. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for
Thank you.
the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.